Now, next we come to a story that I've been wanting to touch on for a little while now because it's been affecting uh, lots of my friends and also lots of my academic acquaintances as well. As we often, as you often highlight, I am a fan of the late first millennium AD in the UK. Ever since I worked at the Orient Viking Centre and for the York Archaeological Trust, Saxons and Vikings is what we're talking about. And the question here, the question that's become increasingly rampant, and in fact, there's even a link I just noticed just now. That there's even a link to this has made its way into newspapers like The Sun, red top tabloid newspapers as a story. And the question is simple: is the term Anglo-Saxon racist? Now, this has this well, as I said, this has been floating around my academic and friendship circle for a little while now, and it was brought to a head on February the 7th in a video by History with Hilbert, in a video entitled "Is Anglo-Saxon a racist term, and should my degree be banned?" He's doing an ASNC degree, Anglo-Saxon, Norse, and Celtic degree. And my understanding is that this question has been asked, and one of the main proponents of this question is Dr. Mary Rambaran Olm, who is a Canadian working in Ireland, I think, living and working in Ireland now, who is convinced that that Anglo-Saxon is a racist term. But it gets complicated because this is a very new world perspective. It's not, and it doesn't take account of lots of British context in particular for the word Anglo-Saxon. Now, before we get into that, what's your initial thoughts about this as a question? Because there are context and caveats which we can come to. But what initially do you
Right,
think of it?
right. Um, we are living in an age of increasingly identity-based politics,
Hmm.
and uh, that coincides, or part of it, part of the manifestation of that is identity-based discussions that are taking place in academia.
Mm.
Um, and manifestations of that include things like the Rhodes Must Fall campaign in Oxford, about links with the imperialist Cecil Rhodes,
Hmm.
um, and issues. We talked in an earlier segment about Black history, for example, and ideas around reparations and restorations of what are often termed stolen goods from our museums
Hmm. Hmm.
and so on. Um, so it, when you then add to that mix the uh, identitarian movement, that is, and particularly the white identitarian movements that take in the United States and Britain in particular,
Hmm. Hmm.
uh, you're coming up with a fairly toxic brew,
Mm. Mm.
and but those things are inevitably going to spill over because they're about establishing a narrative.
Mm.
Then the need to establish, for example, a white cultural narrative
Hmm.
for uh, white supremacists, that inevitably is going to cross over into academic discussions. And
Well, uh, and for my part, I suppose I would say that it crosses over into those discussions when people are. I'm
wanting to
trying.
make a point.
Well, yes, wanting to make a point, but also, uh, I mean, I suppose to be blunt, when they're willfully ignorant of other academic cultures and the reasons for certain terminology existing. Uh,
Yeah.
for example, the point is made that Anglo-Saxon is racist because it's connected to the acronym WASP, White Anglo-Saxon Protestant, in the US. This has been linked to white supremacy thinking in the US in particular, but also across the Americas. Obviously, Canada isn't immune from this stuff, um, and that may well be true. But Anglo-Saxon really, the origin of the term, and historically as a term used in history and archaeological studies, has never really actually described, arguably, anything. I mean, in so much as it describes a broad movement of people in the post-Roman world, actually towards the end, I suppose, of the Roman period. Some people think the Romans actually even invited people in from what is now Germany, Denmark, etc., to live and fight and work and settle in what became England. They set up the Heptarchy, 7 kingdoms of England, that eventually became England. And that is not a racial terminology. That is a culture. Some people even have trouble archaeologically identifying what Saxon, for example, what is a Saxon burial. Some people, it used to be fashionable to link certain types of brooches with Saxons, for example, but even that's been shown to be not particularly consistent. It is not a racial term, and it's not linked with a particular. It's certainly not linked with a skin color, for example. But where it gets really problematic is when some of the proponents of this argument start to suggest alternatives, particularly when they're suggesting these alternatives from a New World perspective. Um, the idea that we should just refer to them all of these people as English or Anglekin has been suggested. But again, if you
No.
asked someone in Northumbria if they were kin of Angles, they probably wouldn't say yes. In fact, they almost certainly wouldn't say yes. There's a reason why East
Or
Anglia.
someone living in Wales, or someone living in Cornwall, or
Well,
someone living on
well,
the east or west of
Well,
Scotland, or
although,
yeah,
you've slightly preempted me there, in so much as that's the complication
sorry,
within England, in so much as at that
yeah,
point,
yeah.
England and Englishness was not inevitable. It was not bound to happen. If you start calling all these people English, it implies that England was bound to happen. As you say, never mind the fact that, for example, one of the alternative terms that's been suggested has been early British or proto-British or something like along those lines. But that demonstrates an immense ignorance of what the complication of these islands, so the constituency of these islands and the complication of these islands is. People don't talk about Hen Oglev, the Old North, for example, in common parlance, because England, yes, came to be, and it snubbed out some of the old northern kingdoms that had connections between Scotland and Ireland. Wales and the northeast of England, for example, had connections. There were also all these subtle cultural connotations that existed and have been accommodated in the terminology surrounding Anglo-Saxon studies and have led to terminology such as Anglo-Saxon in an effort to try and describe something which is incredibly complicated and messy, and dare I say, very human as well. It's and also, frankly, from a obviously, I'm not saying everyone in my family going back forever in history is Welsh, but as a modern Welshman, um, it is insulting to have someone suggest that everything that happened on this island is essentially Englishness and English culture. That's nonsense. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's racist, but it's nonsense. And so
Yeah.
I'm frustrated by this conversation because it seems to be unnuanced and it seems to be essentially driven by people, um, well, going for keywords. I mean, as you jokingly said at an earlier segment, people being triggered, as it were. And I suspect that what I suspect that what people need to do is revisit some of these assumptions because actually,
Well,
well, say let me just say so one more thing, and actually one of the reasons why I'm suggesting this is not only is it affecting my colleagues and our colleagues, sorry, but also there have been people who have felt the need to step down from their jobs. I won't link to or name, for example, this particular person, but one person has stepped down from being the editor of a journal because they feel that they're no longer able to continue being associated with that journal because the amount of abuse they're getting for being racist, when Anglo-Saxon in this context is not a racist term. You know, it's important that we have this conversation and we have it properly. Anyway, sorry.
yeah. All I was going to say was I'm very much with you on this. I just wanted to cite a couple of things. One of the articles that it encapsulates the anti use of Anglo-Saxon, if you like. It's an article that was published in February in Varsity, which is the magazine of Cambridge University, by somebody called by a writer called Jack Durand, and the title of the piece is "The University of Cambridge must renounce the use of the term ASNAC," which is the Anglo-Saxon, Norse, and I can't remember the full acronym,
Celtic.
but Celtic. Sorry, thank you.
Although that's problematic in a whole other way. But anyway, go on.
Yeah, exactly. We won't go there
because it's messy.
We've got enough problems on our plate with Anglo-Saxon. Yeah, but no, I mean, Jack Durand's opening paragraph lays out the stall.
Yeah.
The university's continued use of the term, quotes, Anglo-Saxon is not only broadly ahistorical, but also a tacit endorsement of the cultural baggage of institutionalised racism and white supremacy with which it has always been associated, both within and outside the academy. Now, there is so much to take issue with just in that paragraph.
Yes. It's incorrect. It's simply incorrect.
Well,
but so go on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then that article in turn prompted, and you pointed me in the direction of this video, and thank you very much. But a video by on a YouTube channel, which History with Hilbert, I think, is the name of the YouTube channel, and it's a 35-minute interrogation, really, of that paragraph from the point of view, yes, of somebody who works in that field. My goodness, an expert who actually has direct knowledge of what they're talking about, and is able to interrogate the argument and points out, for example, things like the term Anglo-Saxon was used, but it's not ahistorical. It was used in the period. It was one of the King of the Anglo-Saxons was one of the titles that was given to Alfred the Great after the conquest of London in the I think the 860s. It is a genuine historical term. You can't uninvent it.
No. Well, and also in that sense, at the time, it was also controversial to call yourself King of Britain. For example, Athelstan tried it, when actually, in many ways, he wasn't King of Britain. He was King of the Saxons and the Angles and the Jutes and the king, the heptarchy essentially, and thereof.
Absolutely, and Athelstan's army at the Battle of Lunenburg was famously a very cosmopolitan alliance of various different groups, as was the army on the other side, the Viking army on the other side.
It's also interesting as well that in the Varsity article he says that although disavowed now by professional historians, whiteness and self-identification as Anglo-Saxon has come to be tied inextricably to implicit superiority and freedom. I don't know where he's getting that from. Again, with it, I'm afraid I've never, I don't know. It's simply wrong. Now the thing is, there are discussions and debates to be had about actually how to refer to the early medieval period of Britain, and in particular of England.
Yeah.
For example, I've interviewed in the past an archaeosoup, Howard Williams, who's written many tongue-in-cheek blog posts, but also frequently on Twitter would be found to be suggesting alternatives to Anglo-Saxon as a term for early modern Britain. He also likes to jibe me about the existence of horns on helmets, for example. None of these, as the article says here, professional historians or archaeologists or serious people in the field are tied to this term as a racial terminology, and that indeed they're open to questioning what Anglo-Saxon means and whether or not it's actually an adequate term. But mainly because we've been challenging it. Mainly because we've been challenging it now for about 40 years within the field, within Anglo-Saxon studies. It's always been problematic, but not for the reason that these people are complaining about.
No, that was the point I was about to make. in my own journey in archaeology, which began about 40 years ago,
Hmm.
as you've just alluded to,
Hmm.
I started off getting really interested in what we then called the Dark Ages,
Yeah, yeah.
or some
Hmm.
people called the Arthurian period.
Oh,
The
whoa.
Dark Ages,
Yes, go on.
the dark, the Dark Ages then became the post-Roman period,
Hmm.
then became the early, the early Middle Ages,
Hmm. Hmm.
um, and the Anglo-Saxon period was part of the early Middle Ages because of those self-definitions from that period
Hmm.
in the chronicles
Hmm.
and so on, which referred to the Anglo-Saxons as a group. But it wasn't about, mostly it wasn't about racial identity. It was actually about time. It was about the span of a particular period, and it was normally at that point again. It was normally judged in to be from AD 410 to 1066.
Hmm.
And how do you define that period?
Yeah,
And
but
I think.
so go ahead.
And I'll just pick up another point from the article in Varsity, and in the penultimate paragraph. Uh, in the penultimate paragraph, Duran says, here we go. Just as women's or African American studies courses inevitably attract students from corresponding backgrounds, so too will the study of Anglo-Saxon, Norse, or Celtic. However, while the former seek to recover the internationally suppressed voices of their respective communities, the latter perpetuate an image of early medieval studies as a field of racial and ethnic exclusivity. Now, again, you and I both know that one of the huge debates across archaeology at the moment is identifying complexities in ethnic identity.
Yeah.
It's about identifying the the missing people of African heritage in the European story and so on,
Hmm.
who are there.
One
You
of
know,
probably
that's not what this is about.
no, probably my favorite discovery from, so for example, the Viking world is the Buddha bucket,
Mm.
so called, um, on the Usaberg Viking ship, the largest ship burial recovered from that time. A ship that incidentally was seemingly built in Ireland, made its way eventually to Norway, was for a queen, not a king, and had connections with the international world through trade. The idea that me knowing that, having studied this period, is reinforcing racial stereotypes is simply ignorant. It is just ignorant of what is actually going on within the field and within, and as you say,
Yeah.
what people are seeking to do. As I mentioned in a previous segment,
Not to mention that one of our best primary sources for the Viking period is an Arab writer.
yeah, no, exactly, yeah,
Yeah.
in what is now in Constantinople, essentially, yeah, yeah, precisely,
Yeah.
and also in a previous segment this month, I've mentioned we are interested in what is new about the past. No one would be in an Anglo-Saxon, Norse, and Celtic degree wanting just to go, yes, yes, I knew that. Yes, okay, cool, right, great, brilliant. We're interested in especially, for example, when it comes to Celtic studies, for example, language, linguistic connections, connections between Brythonic dialects and Sanskrit. It's not our fault that you don't know what the fuck you're talking about. And so in that, and I say that in all seriousness, in so much as I wouldn't presume to question the validity, for example, of African studies or African American cultural connections and related degrees, unless I knew what was going on in that field, and I don't in that much detail. I don't know where to begin in terms of questioning terminology. It's not our fault that on a surface level, some cretinous Muppets have decided to use the term Anglo-Saxon as a catch-all for white folk. That's
Yeah.
that's not the academics' fault. That's not uh, again some of my colleagues who've been abused and harassed. Our colleagues, sorry, abused, harassed, and harangued on Twitter. It's not their fault that some hick in Alabama uses that term or used that term to set up an organization historically, which excluded people of color. is there a way to end this particular segment? Because actually, I'm sure this will lead to further conversation at some point. Is there a way to end this
I think
that's actually inclusive and inviting people to learn more? For example, I suppose I mean I'll hand over to your thoughts on that question in just a moment. But for example, my answer to that question would be to say, as you've just alluded to, terminology like dark ages and transitional periods, liminal zones, all this sort of stuff, these are inherently difficult to describe. And perhaps, uh, perhaps there is a movement in trying to find some early words to describe this terminology, which is helpful in some of these conversations. But I suppose I would invite people to get involved in the muck, get involved in the complexity of the period that we're looking at, and understand it. Come on, dive on in. The water's fine, and crucially, it's also not a white supremacist hotbed. Get
no.
involved,
Look,
learn more. You're welcome.
yeah,
Yeah, go ahead.
exactly. Um, it, it, Reduced to a pithy soundbite just to finish. Engage brain before opening mouth,
Yeah,
or
yeah,
writing, or penning article.
yeah,
Do your research.
yeah.
Um, because polemics are great,
Hmm.
but they don't have any. You know, the, if they stand on sand, they'll collapse. It's. I'm the trouble is, unfortunately, we live in times when uh, offence is taken on things that didn't used to cause offence,
Mm.
either real offence or affected offence,
Hmm. Hmm.
and it it's something we're all learning to deal with, particularly with social media and pylons that things like this generate.
Hmm.
And people very glibly say, "Be nice." Yeah, please be nice. Be nice, but do your research too.
I think so. I think so. And it is medievalists.net. I would encourage people to start there. Actually, there's been several good articles in recent years examining not only the existence of, for example, people of color in medieval Europe in particular, but also actually there's also articles of medievalists supporting each other, saying so. White supremacists seem to be obsessed with my research. I've never talked to a white supremacist. What on earth do I do to make it clear that I'm not that?
Yeah,
It is a problem. Yeah, there are people out there who abuse and abuse some of this research, but
absolutely.
it's not inherent in the terminology.
No,
And crucially, responsible medievalists have been aware of this long before people who wrote these criticisms.
absolutely. And then there is one point I would just make to finish, and that is it's a serious point about the the blatant misuse of, particularly at the moment, medieval
Mm,
and Viking and uh, history and culture for far right political purposes.
mhm,
And we saw it. We're just sadly just coming up for the first anniversary of the mosque shooting in Christchurch, where
mm,
the shooter alluded to Charles Martel and
mhm, mhm,
the the Battle of Tours.
mm,
Um, and I wrote a piece in response to that for on Pipeline, where uh, I took the view and take the view now that uh, as a profession, as a sector, if we identify this stuff, we have to engage with it and we have to refute it.
yeah,
I think that's a social responsibility now,
mhm,
um, but given where it can go, as we saw in Christchurch and in other places.
yeah,
So this is it's not just an academic spat; it's serious stuff, actually.
yeah. No, I agree. I agree.
Sadly,
Well, and um, I'm not extending this endlessly, I promise you. But also, in that sense, in terms of refuting, that refutation, is that a word? Refutation.
refutation.
Refutation. That refutation uh, doesn't. doesn't and should not take the form of changing terminology. If we change terminology, supremacists will follow that terminology. They'll simply say, "Okay, English folk," or whatever, early British folk. That again, the terminology is not at fault within the field. But it is down to us to make it clear that it's not that these ideas are not welcome in that field.
They're just not welcome because they're just not valid.
Well, so
You
yes,
can't make an
sorry,
intelligent case.
yeah. I'm not saying that there's an yeah. Oh no, I've undermined everything. Ah, no, yeah. So they're just not welcome. Sorry.
Yeah.
Um,